Disclaimer: this content is only for mature audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. I always thought I knew my husband. After all, we had been married for 5 years of laughter, of whispered dreams, of knowing each other's favorite coffee orders and the exact way we liked our pillows fluffed. But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered that night. It started like any other evening. We had just finished dinner, the soft hum of music playing in the background, and the comforting scent of vanilla candles filling the living room. He was relaxed, scrolling through his phone, while I curled up on the couch, lost in a book. It was peaceful, ordinary, until it wasn't. A single message changed everything. His phone vibrated, and I caught the flicker of something in his eyes, something I had never seen before. He quickly turned the screen away, his body stiffening. It was subtle, but I noticed. "Who's that?" I asked, my voice light, playful even. But instead of answering, he hesitated. And in that moment, a tiny crack formed in the foundation of everything I believed about him. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe he just needed space. But as the night went on, his behavior grew stranger. He kept checking the time. His usual warmth felt distant, replaced by an energy I couldn't quite place. Then, at exactly 11:45 p.m., he stood up abruptly. "I have to go out for a bit," he said, avoiding my gaze. At that point, my heart was pounding. My husband was a creature of routine, never one for late-night outings, never one to keep secrets. But that night, he was different. I wanted to ask more, but something told me I wouldn't like the answer. So I did something I had never done before. I followed him. And what I saw shattered everything I thought I knew about the man I married. But before I tell you what happened next, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where you realized someone wasn't who you thought they were? Drop a comment below or vote in the poll. Would you have followed your husband, or trusted him and let it go? Let me know, and stay tuned for part 2, because trust me, this story is just getting started. The night air was colder than I expected, wrapping around me like a warning. I stayed a few steps behind as my husband walked down the quiet street, his pace steady, his head slightly lowered. My heart pounded so loudly I was afraid he'd hear it. I had never done anything like this before, never felt the need to. But something inside me refused to let this go. I knew my husband. Or at least, I thought I did. He was predictable, comfortable, the kind of man who double-checked the locks before bed and always set the coffee pot for the next morning. He didn't lie, didn't keep secrets. So why did it feel like I was following a stranger? He turned a corner, and for a second, I almost lost him. My breath caught as I hurried to keep up, careful not to let my footsteps echo too loudly on the pavement. He finally stopped in front of a dimly lit building. My stomach twisted. It wasn't a restaurant, a store, or anywhere familiar. Just a plain, unmarked door. No signs. No windows. Just a single overhead light buzzing faintly in the darkness. He pulled out his phone, tapped something quickly, and then, he knocked. 3 times. A specific rhythm. Not just a casual tap, but something precise. Purposeful. My body tensed as the door creaked open, and a man I had never seen before stepped out. He was older, maybe mid-50s, with sharp eyes that flickered over my husband before nodding and stepping aside. Without hesitation, my husband walked in. The door shut behind him, locking with a heavy click. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. What was this place? Who was that man? And why had my husband looked so sure, so familiar with all of it? I moved closer, pressing myself against the cool brick wall. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Was it a secret meeting? A gambling ring? Something worse? No matter how much I tried to make sense of it, nothing fit. Minutes passed. I checked my phone, my hands shaking. Should I call him? Pretend I woke up and he wasn't home? But what if he knew I had followed him? What if I wasn't supposed to see this? Then, just as I was debating what to do next, the door creaked open again. I shrank back into the shadows, holding my breath. Another man stepped out, not my husband, but someone different. He looked around cautiously before disappearing down the street. A few moments later, another person exited. Then another. I felt a chill run down my spine. How many people were inside? And why did it feel like they were leaving in a certain order, like something had just concluded in there? I didn't know what I had stumbled into, but one thing was clear. My husband wasn't the man I thought he was. And whatever he was involved in, I wasn't supposed to know. Now, I had a choice. Walk away and pretend I never saw any of this. Or stay and find out the truth. What would you do? Would you confront your partner? Keep watching to find out what happened next. I stood there, hidden in the shadows, my fingers gripping the cold brick wall as I tried to steady my breath. Every nerve in my body was telling me to turn around, to go home, to pretend none of this was happening. But my heart, my gut, refused to listen. My husband had walked into that building like he belonged there, like this was a part of his life that had nothing to do with me. And that was what scared me the most. The minutes stretched endlessly as I watched more people trickle out, each one glancing around as if making sure they weren't being followed. Their faces were unfamiliar, their expressions unreadable. I wanted to get closer, to peek inside before the door shut again, but just as I took a cautious step forward, I saw him. My husband emerged, his posture tense, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His eyes flickered around the empty street before he exhaled sharply and started walking fast. Not toward home. Not toward anywhere I recognized. Without thinking, I followed. Again. The night air carried a heavy silence, interrupted only by the distant hum of traffic. He walked with purpose, not looking back, not hesitating. My heart pounded as I trailed him, every step making me question whether I really wanted to know where he was going. Because what if the truth was worse than the not knowing? Then, suddenly, he stopped. I barely had time to react before he pulled out his phone and made a call. His voice was too low for me to hear, but I could see his jaw tightening, his free hand curling into a fist at his side. He was angry. No, frustrated. And whoever was on the other end of that call was only making it worse. I ducked behind a parked car, straining to catch any words, any hint of what was going on. But before I could get closer, he ended the call and took off again, this time faster. And then, just when I thought I had lost him, he turned a corner and disappeared into a quiet cafe. A cafe? At this hour? I hesitated. This wasn't what I expected. A secret meeting in an unmarked building was one thing, but now he was just getting coffee. It didn't make sense. Still, I couldn't walk away now. I crept closer, peering through the large window, and that's when I saw her. A woman. Sitting at a corner table, waiting for him. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable, but there was something in the way she held his gaze that sent a jolt through me. This wasn't the first time they had met. There was history there, an understanding. My husband sat down, his shoulders still tense, but he leaned in, speaking low, his hands gesturing in a way that told me this wasn't casual. I felt the ground shift beneath me. Who was she? What were they talking about? And why did it feel like, in this moment, I was the outsider looking into his life, one I had never known existed? Before I reveal what happened next, tell me, what would you do? Would you walk in and demand answers, or wait and find out more? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to watch the next part, because trust me, this story is far from over. I couldn't move. I stood outside the cafe, my fingers gripping the strap of my purse so tightly that my knuckles ached. My husband sat across from this woman, speaking in low, urgent tones. His hands moved as he talked, gesturing, explaining, maybe even pleading. But for what? For her to understand? Or for me, standing in the cold, to walk away before I found out the truth? My stomach twisted as I watched her expression shift. She wasn't just listening, she was waiting. Her lips pressed together, her eyes sharp with something I couldn't quite name. Was it anger? Worry? Or something worse, something familiar? I knew I should leave. If he caught me here, I wouldn't have an explanation. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized I didn't need an explanation. The truth was playing out in front of me. He wasn't acting like a man who had run into an old friend. This wasn't a casual conversation. It was something bigger. Then she did something that made my heart stop. She reached across the table and took his hand. It wasn't romantic, at least not in the way I had feared. But it was intimate, the kind of touch shared between two people who had been through something together. Something I knew nothing about. 1,000 thoughts crashed through my mind. Was she from his past? Someone he had loved before me? Or worse, was she from his present? I had to know. I turned toward the door, ready to walk in, to sit down at that table and demand answers. But just as my hand touched the door handle, my husband's expression changed. His posture stiffened. He let go of her hand and leaned in even closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Whatever he had just heard or seen had shaken him. The woman's eyes darted toward the window. Toward me. For a split second, our gazes locked, and I felt a cold, sinking feeling in my chest. She knew. She knew I was watching. And the way she looked at me, it wasn't guilt. It wasn't pity. It was something else entirely. Something I should have been afraid of. Before I could react, my husband stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He didn't even glance toward the window. He just grabbed his phone, said something hurriedly to her, and walked out, fast. I barely had time to duck behind the corner before he stepped outside. He stood there for a moment, rubbing the back of his neck, his breath visible in the cold air. Then, without a word, he started walking away from home. Away from her. I had two choices. I could follow him and find out where this path led. Or I could finally stop running after answers I wasn't sure I wanted. What would you do? Stay hidden and keep watching? Or finally step forward and confront the truth? Let me know in the comments. Because in the next part, everything changes. I made my choice. I followed him. The night stretched ahead, silent except for the faint rhythm of his footsteps on the pavement. He wasn't heading home. He wasn't going back to the strange building either. He moved with urgency, his shoulders tense, checking over his shoulder every few steps. He was being careful. Too careful. As if he knew someone might be watching. My heart pounded as I kept my distance, ducking behind parked cars and streetlights whenever he slowed. I didn't know what I was looking for anymore, an explanation? A confession? A sign that this was all just some horrible misunderstanding? But deep down, I already knew the truth. The man I had trusted, the man I had built a life with, was hiding something from me. And I was about to find out what. He turned down a narrow alley, pausing at a rusted metal door. My breath caught as he knocked 3 times. The same rhythm as before. My stomach clenched. This was it. The real truth was on the other side of that door. I crept closer, pressing myself against the brick wall, my breath shallow. The door opened just a crack, and a deep voice spoke from inside. I couldn't make out the words, but my husband responded quickly, his voice tight, controlled. Then, without hesitation, he stepped inside. I had seconds to decide. Walk away, or follow him into the unknown. The decision was made for me. Before I could move, a hand clamped around my wrist, yanking me back into the shadows. A gasp escaped my lips, but before I could scream, I was spun around, face to face with her. The woman from the cafe. Up close, she was even more striking. Dark eyes, sharp features, an expression that sent a shiver down my spine. But it wasn't anger on her face. It wasn't guilt, either. It was something worse. Pity. You shouldn't be here, she whispered. My pulse thundered in my ears. Who are you? I hissed, struggling against her grip. Why are you meeting with my husband? What is he hiding? Her jaw tightened. You don't want to know. Her voice was calm, too calm, and that terrified me more than anything. I yanked my arm free, my breath coming fast. I already know, I shot back. I saw him go into that building. I saw him meet you. He's been lying to me. So if you're going to stand here and tell me I should just walk away, you're wasting your time. She studied me for a long moment. Then, finally, she exhaled, shaking her head. It's not about me, she said quietly. It never was. Before I could ask what she meant, she glanced toward the alley. A flicker of something, fear, passed over her face. Then she turned back to me. "If you go in there," she said, her voice lower now, "your life will never be the same." I stared at her, my hands trembling, my mind spinning with possibilities. But I had already come too far to stop now. If you were in my shoes, would you listen to her warning, or walk through that door? Tell me in the comments. Because what happens next changes everything. I took a deep breath, ignoring the pounding in my chest. The woman's warning echoed in my mind, but it was too late to turn back. I had to know. I pushed forward, slipping through the door just as it started to close behind my husband. The air inside was thick with something unspoken, something heavy. Dim lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the concrete walls. The space was nothing like I expected, no secret affair, no hidden betrayal in the way I had imagined. Instead, it looked like an old warehouse, cluttered with scattered chairs and a long table where a few people sat, their gazes sharp, their conversation hushed. Then I saw him. My husband stood at the far end of the room, his back to me, speaking in a voice so firm, so different from the man I knew. "We don't have time," he said, pulling something from his jacket. A folder. He dropped it onto the table. "This is all of it. Everything we've been waiting for." I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. Waiting for what? Someone else spoke, a man with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing. "And she doesn't know?" My husband hesitated. And then, slowly, he shook his head. A cold wave of realization crashed over me. He was talking about me. I felt my stomach drop, but before I could move, the woman from the cafe appeared beside me. I hadn't even heard her follow me inside. "I told you not to come," she murmured, her voice unreadable. I turned to her, my whisper shaky. "What is this? Who are they? What is he doing here?" She hesitated, then sighed. "He's protecting you." I blinked. Protecting me? From what? Before she could answer, a voice cut through the room. My husband's. What was that? He turned suddenly, his eyes scanning the shadows until they landed on me. Everything stopped. For a long second, we just stared at each other. His face drained of color, his eyes widening with something that looked like fear. Not anger. Fear. I stepped forward, my voice trembling. "Tell me the truth." Silence. Then, slowly, he closed his eyes, exhaled. When he opened them again, something in him broke. "I was trying to keep you out of this," he said, his voice raw. "I never wanted you to know." "Know what?" The man at the table stood up. "There's no point hiding it now," he said, glancing between us. "She's already here." My husband ran a hand over his face, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen him. Then, finally, he spoke. "I'm not who you think I am." I felt the room tilt, the weight of his words slamming into me. Everything, the late nights, the secrecy, the lies, it was never about another woman. It was something bigger. Something dangerous. And I had just walked straight into it. What would you do if you discovered your partner was living a double life? Comment below. Because the truth. It's only the beginning. I stood frozen, staring at my husband as his words sank in. "I'm not who you think I am." The room seemed to shrink, the weight of the truth pressing in from all sides. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. "What does that mean?" I finally whispered. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "I was never just your husband. I was trying to protect you from the part of my life I hoped you'd never have to know about." He hesitated. "But now you do." The older man at the table sighed, closing the folder with a firm hand. "There's no going back now," he muttered. I felt my breath catch. Going back from what? My husband stepped forward, his gaze locking onto mine, filled with something that wasn't regret but resignation. "I work for people who handle things, quietly. Things that can't be traced back. And tonight, you walked into something that wasn't meant for you." I swallowed hard. "And if I hadn't?" His jaw tightened. "Then I could have kept you safe." I let out a shaky breath, my heart hammering. "Safe from what?" The woman beside me finally spoke. "From the truth," she said simply. A long silence stretched between us, filled only by the distant hum of the city outside. I looked at my husband, the man I had loved, trusted, built a life with, and I realized something. There was no version of this where things went back to the way they were. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. But maybe, so had he. He must have seen it in my eyes because his expression softened just slightly. I never wanted to lie to you, he said quietly. But if I had told you the truth from the start, would you have stayed? I didn't have an answer. Maybe I never would. He reached for my hand, but I stepped back. Not out of fear. Not out of anger. But because I wasn't sure who I was holding on to anymore. I need time, I said. To understand what all of this means. He nodded, but there was something in his gaze that told me he already knew. That no matter how much time I took, things would never be the same. And maybe, that was the real truth.